Thanks for inviting me.
So, Scott, in my introduction, I alluded to the statements coming out of Ukraine. I guess that begs the simple question: is the Ukrainian counteroffensive finally gaining momentum? Have they finally reached a turning point after all this time?
I mean, to answer that question, I guess we have to know what the goals and objectives of the current phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive are. We know that when they initiated this counteroffensive back in early June of this year, the goals were quite clear: to break through the first line of Russian defenses, the second line of Russian defenses, seize the town of Tokmak, and then use that as a launching point to penetrate deeper through the Russian defenses to seize the city of Melitopol, which would enable them to sever the land bridge between Crimea and Russia and bring Crimea under direct attack. That was the stated objective put forward by General Zaluzhny, echoed by President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials. This is the reason why they asked for significant 300 tanks from NATO, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, unlimited quantities of ammunition. They asked for NATO to train 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers in 12 brigades that would be dedicated to this counteroffensive. That hasn't happened. As we speak, the Ukrainians are claiming that they have put infantry units beyond the so-called dragon's teeth, the concrete obstacles that constitute the first line of Russia's defenses. But even the Ukrainians themselves say that no armored vehicles have made it past that point, so one has to question what sort of penetration this is. The dragon's teeth are designed to prevent armored vehicles from crossing, not light infantry groups carrying out limited reconnaissance. But be that as it may, I think there's a misperception of what the first line of defense is for Russia, because here we are in September, which means now that for 3 months, the Ukrainians have been beating their heads against what? Not the first line of defense, but the forward defensive zone. That is the defensive zone designed to receive an enemy attack. This is part of a new Russian defensive doctrine. I mean, Russia's always had a primarily defensive doctrine inherited from the Soviet times, but this new defensive doctrine that's being implemented, especially in the Zaporizhia front, is the brainchild of Lieutenant General Alexander Romanchuk, former deputy commander, I believe, of the 58th Combined Arms Army, was sent to the Combined Arms Academy after participating in the early phases of the special military operation, and was brought out of, while he was at the Combined Arms Academy, he rewrote Russian defensive doctrine. And then he was brought out of the Combined Arms Academy and given a leadership position in the Zaporizhia front, in the Robotyno area, Robotyno being a village in Zaporizhia that has been the center of much of this counteroffensive. He designed this defense. And if you read his writings, the articles he has published about this, the purpose of the forward defensive zone is to receive an enemy attack, to help break it up, to use defensive belts, minefields, obstacles, what they call fire cauldrons or sacks, where you want to force the enemy to come in so you can hit them with artillery, to break up the attack, but not to hold and die. That is, as the enemy presses forward, the idea is to minimize your own losses by withdrawing back to prepared positions and continuing to bring the enemy under increasing levels of firepower from air, from artillery, from anti-tank guided missiles, etc., all the while bogging them down with minefields, other obstacles. The first line of defense is not meant to be the Alamo. That's a reference to an American battle back in 1836 when the Mexican army stormed a Texan defensive position, the Alamo, and the Texan defenders fought and died there. That's not what the Russians are doing. They're not trying to recreate the Alamo. If the Ukrainians achieve localized superiority, the Russians will withdraw. to other defensive positions, bringing the Ukrainians in further. The irony here is that the first line of defense is meant to be broken by the Ukrainians, usually at a time and place determined not by the Ukrainians, but by the Russians who've been shaping the battlefield. So even if the Ukrainians have succeeded in penetrating the first line of Russia's defense, this is done by design. This is not the final battle. They would still need to exploit this breach, move on to the second line of defense, where they'll come under even increasing intensity of attack. But this is what we need to understand. At this point in the fight, Ukraine has committed its strategic reserve, the final core, 3 brigades that they had been holding back. This was the exploitation force. This was the force that was supposed to be committed into the battle when Tokmak, which is behind the second line of defense, fell to the Ukrainians. This was the force that was supposed to push through the Russian defenses and seize the city of Melitopol, completing the objective. The strategic reserve is being committed because the initial wave of the attack, the follow-on attack, have all failed to break through the defensive zone in front of the first line of defense. Even if they are successful in breaching the first line of defense, which again, I remind everybody, is what the first line of defense is designed to do. It's not designed to be the final stand. It's designed to shape the enemy attack, bring them where you want them to be, focus the attack to where you can bring firepower to bear on the problem. Even if they succeeded in doing this, and there's no evidence that they have, there's nothing left. They will burn themselves out before the second line of defense. The Ukrainians have no follow-on forces. This counteroffensive is over. People will continue to die, but it has no chance whatsoever of meeting its ambitious goals. It can't even meet a secondary goal. Some people have said now that the Ukrainians would be satisfied in seizing the city of Tokmak, the village of Tokmak, the second line of defense. They're not going to get there. This battle's over. It's a cleaning up operation now, as the strategic reserves are bled white. The Russians will push them back, and the rest is history.
I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, because when you look at what senior Ukrainian military officials say, they make the following argument: that the first line of Russian defenses was the most well-prepared, the most difficult, the most robust. And that if they succeed in breaching that line, all of the other lines are not as difficult, they're not as robust. And that if they basically break through the first line, the rest of the defenses will soon afterwards crumble. Does that argument have any merit?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's allowing the Ukrainians to define Russian military doctrine. So I would always say that, it's not up to the Ukrainians to determine what the Russians do. It's up to the Russians to determine what the Russians do. And if you read General Romanchuk's doctrine, yes, the first line of defense will be robustly held. The idea, of course, is not to make it easy for the Ukrainians. But because the Russian forces aren't fighting to the death, the Russian forces are designed to withdraw to prepared defensive positions. That's the second line of defense. So if the Russians do make the decision to withdraw to the second line of defense, it doesn't require them to be fully manned already. The surviving forces, which will be the majority of the Russian forces, because the Russian forces aren't being engaged in a decisive battle. They're not putting their main power forward. They're screening. They're delaying. They're attriting the enemy, not themselves. They will fall back on the second line of defense, and the Ukrainians will find that the second line of defense will be as well defended or more well defended than the first line of defense. So I 100% disagree with the Ukrainians. They're seeking to shape perception, but the reality is far, far different. The reality be shaped by the decisions of Russian generals, not by the rhetoric of Ukrainian commanders.
The main topic of discussion over the past week has been the village of Rabatina. Now, the Ukrainians have claimed that following 3 months of heavy fighting and casualties, they finally captured the village. By contrast, Russian sources are stating that they still control the southern part of the village and they're offering resistance. But regardless, for argument's sake, let's assume that the Ukrainians have fully captured Robotyne. Is that a significant victory for the Ukrainian army?
No, the village of Robotyne was always meant to fall. If the Ukrainians put sufficient military power in a specific zone of operations, they should be able to advance and seize terrain that the Russians have decided will be defended, but not to the death. Robotyne was always meant to be part of the crumple zone in the forward element defensive zone of the first line of defense. The purpose of Robotyne was to help break up the Ukrainian attacks, and it has done this magnificently. The defenders, the Russian defenders, I'm not someone who awards state awards, but I would say that the men who have prosecuted the defense of Robotyne are heroes. That it's been heroic. It's been militarily brilliant. What they have done, they have forced the Ukrainians to throw into the Battle of Robotyne the totality of the force meant to seize Melitopol. They have compelled the Ukrainians to burn through their reserves, to burn up their ammunition, to use up their fuel, to deplete their armor, to slaughter their manpower to the point that even if Robotyne falls, the Ukrainians will have no strength left to push on forward. This is part of Alexander Romanchuk's defensive concept, and it's been executed perfectly by the Russians at Robotyne.
And I guess that does beg the question, though, right? If the Ukrainians have lost so much in the battles for Robotyne, why have they continued to attack that village? Why have they invested so much in capturing the village of Robotyne, just like they invested so much in defending Bakhmut?
I mean, this is a political question that can only be answered by the Ukrainians. One can speculate, therefore I will speculate. The Ukrainians premise their entire request for Western military power last fall and into the early months of this year on the fact that they will take this assistance, tens of billions of dollars worth, and turn it into meaningful military activity on the front line. They need to demonstrate to the West that the billions of dollars of assistance, both in terms of material, training, and direct financial assistance, is not assistance given in vain. That if Ukraine asks for military assistance, Ukraine will effectively use this military assistance to further not only Ukrainian objectives, but NATO objectives as well. And, the two aren't necessarily identical. Ukraine's objectives are, of course, the physical reconquest of territory Ukraine believes belongs to it. Russia has said, no, it's now part of Russia. We're talking not only about Crimea, but the districts of Zaporizhia, of Kherson, of Donetsk, and Lugansk. These are now officially, from Russian perspective, part of Russia. The Ukrainians say, no, it's part of Ukraine, and we will reconquer these. We want to return Ukraine's sovereign definition, territorial-wise, to the 1991 borders. NATO's objectives are far different. We know because General Lloyd Austin, the commander or the Secretary of Defense of the United States, outlined these objectives when he spoke in May after returning from a trip to Kiev. He says that NATO, the United States, is seeking the strategic defeat of Russia, and this will be attained when enough harm and pain is inflicted on Russia to cause political change from within Russia. It's not so much about achieving decisive military victory on the battlefield,